My parents kicked me out of the house at 16 to make room for my sister's newborn baby. I posted about how my parents treated me, and my dad begged me to come back when my wealthy grandparents threatened to disinherit him. I turned 16 a week ago. No party, no celebration, and my parents barely managed to congratulate me before kicking me out. The reason was my older sister, Amanda, 22, who has always been their favorite. She's 7 months pregnant now, and since our house has 4 bedrooms, my parents told me on the morning of my birthday that they wanted me to move in with my aunt so one of the rooms could be freed up for the baby. My parents never really cared about me and always did the bare minimum, but this was shocking even for me. I didn't expect much from them anyway, and yet they still found a way to let me down. They were dead serious, so I didn't think for a second they were joking or that this might be a pathetic prank. After they explained they needed the room, and that I was apparently old enough to move out, we sat in silence for a while. They promised to keep paying for all my expenses until I turned 18, and to make sure I was well fed and provided for, but they couldn't let me live under the same roof anymore. I didn't want to argue, but I asked why they couldn't just use the guest room as a nursery. After a brief pause, they said they'd given it to Amanda's boyfriend to live in. So to sum it up, my parents had their room, my sister and her boyfriend had a room, and the baby was supposed to have a separate one. Amanda wasn't home, and I realized this was all done on purpose, so she wouldn't have to witness it or feel guilty. My sister and I were never close because of the age gap, but she never personally treated me badly. We were mostly polite to each other. However, if she was okay with this arrangement and actually wanted me gone to make space for her baby and boyfriend, maybe she wasn't who I thought she was. I was disappointed, especially on my birthday, but I didn't say a word and just agreed to leave. By now, I'd realized my parents were hopeless. There was nothing I could say to make them love me, and I'd come to terms with that. After they told me they wanted me to move to my aunt's, I went to my room and started packing. They helped me, but I think it was just to get me out faster. When I was done, they even drove me to my aunt's house, chatting cheerfully the whole way, not noticing that I wasn't responding and just staring out the window. When we arrived, they dropped me off at the door without even a hug or a kiss goodbye. My aunt greeted me warmly. She genuinely enjoys my company and, as far as I know, loves me more than my parents ever did. I talked to her and eventually told her how disappointed I was with my parents' behavior. She was caught off guard. Things were quiet for a while, but then I heard her yelling on the phone, which is rare since she usually speaks softly. She was arguing, and I realized someone must have really upset her to make her lose her cool. When she came back into the room, her face red with anger and still visibly irritated, I learned that it was indeed my parents who had upset her. It turns out my dad, her brother, had told her I had suggested this arrangement myself for the sake of the baby, and that I was totally fine with leaving home to live with her. That's why she'd been willing to take me in. She'd seen I was never truly happy living with my parents, and my supposed offer made sense to her. But when my dad tried to convince her to take me, it felt odd to her. My aunt, a single woman in her 40s with no plans to marry or have kids, taking me in was almost like gaining a roommate, and she didn't even have to worry about expenses since my dad was covering everything. She loved me and thought I wanted to live with her, so she agreed to the arrangement. But when she learned the truth, she called my dad to chew him out for what they'd done. It was completely unacceptable, and she had to vent her outrage. After the call, my aunt was very upset, and so was I. Not every teenager my age goes through something like this. I always knew my parents loved my sister more, but this was too much. They'd even lied to my aunt to make the situation look better, knowing how awful it was. They gave the guest room to Amanda's boyfriend, who's in his 20s, has a job, and owns his own apartment. If they'd wanted, Amanda could have easily moved in with him, but at my parents' insistence, she stayed home so they could be closer to her. They were willing to sacrifice my comfort just to keep her nearby. It hurt so much, and I decided to go online and expose them. I wasn't sure if my aunt would support me, so I waited until she went to bed. I grabbed my phone, wrote out the whole story, and posted it without a second thought. In the post, I didn't just talk about that day. I also shared how my parents never treated me fairly, and how I always felt like a second-class citizen in my own home. As I typed, I nearly had a breakdown. The post wasn't just an expose, it was raw and emotional. When I posted it, I was crying. Afterward, I turned off my phone for a while, scared of the consequences it would surely bring. About an hour later, I tried reading a book but couldn't focus. Then my aunt woke up, rushed into the living room, where I'd been sitting since arriving, and calmly asked if I'd posted something. I admitted I had, and that was the end of the conversation. No further discussion. When I turned my phone back on, I saw that several relatives had viewed the post, and I'd gotten tons of messages from my parents and even my sister. Many relatives left supportive comments. Some even offered help if I ever needed it. That gave me strength, and I felt better, until I read my parents' messages, full of hate and anger. They clearly didn't like what I'd done and demanded I delete the post. My dad wrote a lot of insulting things about me, even saying he regretted I was ever born. It hurt, but it wasn't surprising. My mom's messages were similar, with the only difference being my sister's. She didn't say much, just suggested meeting in person if possible, and that was it. I didn't know what to say, and was overwhelmed by how many people I had to respond to. So I put my phone down again, and didn't reply to anyone for the next few days. I decided to block my parents since I had no intention of talking to them anymore. I knew they were legally obligated to send me money until I turned 18, and beyond that, I had no reason to stay in touch. My aunt agreed, and if my dad tried contacting her in the days that followed, she didn't tell me. We pretended nothing had happened. That meant she was on my side and supported everything I'd done, which was enough for me. It was all the support I needed. Over the past week, I'd had almost no contact with my parents. But today, they showed up outside my school after classes ended, looking furious. My friends, who knew the situation well, walked with me and acted as a sort of shield so I wouldn't have to talk to them if I didn't want to. But my parents kept calling out to me, and I had to respond. I walked right up to them and said I didn't want anything to do with them anymore, but they brushed it off and demanded I come home with them immediately. I didn't understand why they suddenly wanted me back when they'd made it clear I wasn't a priority. It felt like a desperate attempt to fix their image and reputation among relatives. So I told them I wasn't going anywhere with them until they explained what was going on so I could understand their sudden change in behavior. They looked furious yet insisted I come home. They added that they didn't want my friends to hear, so I asked them to step aside for a private talk. Once my friends couldn't hear us, my parents explained they'd come to get me because I hadn't answered their calls or messages, and they needed me back to secure their inheritance. They said that after my post, almost everyone in the family found out, and word reached my grandparents. My paternal grandparents are pretty well off, and they threatened my dad that if he kept treating me this way, he'd lose his inheritance. They told my parents that if they didn't reconcile with me, treat me better, and make me feel loved and cared for, all the inheritance they were supposed to get would go to my aunt since she's taking care of me even though she shouldn't have to. My dad couldn't afford to lose that inheritance. It was a significant amount of money. My parents had a decent combined income, but I knew if I were in their shoes, I'd probably be scared of losing it too. The difference is, I'd have the sense not to act like they were doing me a favor by taking me back. They weren't doing it for me. They were doing it for themselves. So I told them I didn't care whether they got their inheritance or not and walked away, even as they shouted for me to come back. I got on the bus and went back to my aunt's, told her what happened at school, and she seemed annoyed too. To prevent this from happening again, she contacted her lawyer so we could do something about my custody. Of course, my parents still have legal custody, and that needs to change if I'm going to live with my aunt. I also called my grandparents, thanked them for trying to fix things, but told them I didn't want to go back to my parents. After a few days living with my aunt, I finally felt free. Living with my parents had been suffocating. I'd hoped things would change, but they never did. My grandparents live in another city, so we didn't see them often, and when we did at family gatherings or holidays, my parents always put on a perfect act so no one would know how they really treated me at home. Everything seemed fine on the surface, but spending a few days in their house would reveal they mostly pretended I didn't exist, focusing only on my sister. After she got pregnant, things got worse, and they finally kicked me out. I told my grandparents everything, and they assured me that if I wanted to live with my aunt, they'd make it happen. If my parents gave up custody, they'd cover everything I needed. After that call, I felt happy because things were finally starting to work out. But that happiness didn't last long. A couple of hours ago, I got an email from my dad. It wasn't full of anger or cruelty, but it was disappointing. He said there was no need to post what happened online and make it so public. Word would have reached my grandparents through me anyway. But now, on top of my grandparents being mad at them, they're facing a ton of hate from relatives and being ostracized from the family, which they think is unfair. He added that even some of his colleagues found out because the post showed up in their feeds, since he was tagged in it. It was affecting his job, and according to him, what I did caused a lot of unnecessary drama in their lives. Update 1. I want to answer some questions you might have about why I didn't leave my parents' house earlier and why I waited until they asked me to go, especially since my grandparents and aunt were willing to help. The reason, as I mentioned, is that I wasn't treated cruelly outright. They didn't abuse me directly, they just ignored me and didn't care. It's a form of mistreatment, but I was just glad I wasn't being beaten or yelled at. I still had a roof over my head and food, so I convinced myself I was fine and didn't think it mattered that I didn't feel loved or cared for. I didn't even realize I was being neglected because it had become normal for me. As for why I didn't ask my family for help, I didn't want to burden them. I was also afraid of what would happen if they refused and my parents found out. It would have been bad for me. My parents care a lot about appearances and reputation, so I kept it all inside, trying to deal with it silently. My aunt didn't offer me a place to stay earlier because she didn't want to offend my parents and wasn't even sure I'd want to live with her, so we didn't do it sooner. But now that it's happened naturally, I think it's for the best. Yes, it's a little late, but better late than never. My aunt is currently working with a lawyer to officially become my guardian and convince my parents to give me up. It'll be damn tough since the inheritance is at stake now, but even if it goes to court, I know my grandparents and aunt will always be on my side. My aunt apologized to me from the moment I arrived for never standing up for me, even though she knew my parents were indifferent to me. She regrets not talking to me sooner, thinking it wasn't her place. But now that everything's out in the open, at least communication with my family has improved, and I feel much better about the future. In my post, I also mentioned that my sister messaged me, saying she wanted to meet in person if possible, but I didn't know how to respond, so I ignored her. She never treated me badly herself. She was mostly distant for much of my life. When we did interact, she was generally nice. I thought the idea of kicking me out so her boyfriend and baby could live with her and my parents was hers, and that upset me because it meant she'd start treating me badly and show her true colors. So I didn't reply. Our relationship was weird, tense and strained, but I still preferred her to my parents because when we talked, she was kind to me, and it wasn't her fault they loved her more. 3 days ago, she messaged me again, asking me to come see her. I decided to call her and ask why she wanted to meet. I wasn't going back home, which I assumed was where she was, but to my surprise, she said she's living with her boyfriend now and isn't feeling well enough to go out due to her pregnancy. So she asked me to come to her to talk about everything going on with the family. She said she had things to say, and out of curiosity, I agreed to meet her. When I got there, she first apologized for never standing up for me, even though she knew my parents always favored her, ignored my achievements, and acted like I didn't exist. Then she said she wasn't even told about their decision to kick me out, and was shocked when she found out because she'd never asked for anything like that. Her plan was to live with our parents until the baby was a few months old, then move in with her boyfriend. Though she wanted to leave earlier, she stayed at our parents' insistence. But after my post, she realized things couldn't go on like that, and moved out within a week. That caused a huge fight with our parents. They thought it was a terrible decision, and now won't even talk to her, accusing her of ingratitude and selfishness, which isn't true since she never promised them anything. They just assumed. In the end, since my parents lost both kids, at least my sister apologized for being a bad sister and a bad person overall. I forgive her because I don't think holding a grudge will help me. We talked it out, and she promised to always be on my side from now on, which made me really happy. It's been just under a week since my post, and I haven't heard from my parents since their email, so I assume they've given up trying to get me back. My grandparents probably played a role. They called me and said my parents won't bother me anymore, and I shouldn't worry about them showing up at school or messaging me again. I didn't tell them about the email my dad sent, so maybe my parents and grandparents worked something out. I'm sure my parents had given up. Update 2. It's been just 3 days since my last update, and today my aunt told me my parents agreed to give up their parental rights. The paperwork will be finalized soon, and my aunt will take care of all the legal stuff related to custody. I have mixed feelings. I'm glad I'll finally have a home where I don't constantly feel unwanted and unneeded, but at the same time, I feel an emptiness and sadness for some reason. It's strange that this is finally happening, but it's for the best. This is what I wanted. Update 3. It's been a couple of weeks since my aunt finalized all the paperwork. She is now my legal guardian, so hooray. I also found out my parents only gave up custody after I told my grandparents I didn't want to live with them. My grandparents then told my parents they could either lose all their inheritance or keep 50% of what they were originally set to receive, and give up custody of me, promising never to bother me again. We all know what my parents chose. I'm not surprised, but it's for the best. Thank God. I'm still in touch with my sister, though my parents are trying to mend things with her before she gives birth, but she wants some alone time, and told them she needs space, and for them to stop bothering her every day. I can't help but laugh at the mess they've made of their family. But oh well, I'm happy with my aunt, and that's what matters.